I didn't say a word when Sarah pushed the severance agreement across the table. I simply looked at the digital clock on the wall of the conference room. It was 2:14 p.m. on a Tuesday. In exactly 3 p.m., the core server architecture for the Tri-State Infrastructure Project would begin its automated backup, a process only I had the credentials to authorize. Sarah, a woman who had been my manager for almost 6 months and understood our systems roughly as well as a goldfish understands algebra, adjusted her blazer and gave me a look of practiced sympathy. "It's just about cultural fit, Elena," she said. "We're moving in a more agile direction. We need leaders who pivot, not just maintain." I'd maintained the backbone of this company for 10 years. I knew where every digital ghost was buried. I knew why the legacy code groaned at midnight. And I knew that by Friday, the agile direction they were taking would lead them directly off a cliff. But I didn't tell her that. I just picked up my pen. "Before I tell you how 10 years of loyalty were dismantled in 10 minutes, and how that table eventually became the site of Sarah's professional funeral, you need to decide something. Most people watch these stories, take the value, and leave without a word. They are the Sarahs of the world. If you believe that competence should be rewarded and backstabbing should have a price, hit that subscribe button right now. If you don't, I want you to go to the comments and explain to everyone why you think loyalty is a joke. I'll be reading." Sarah was joined by Marcus from HR. Marcus wouldn't look at me. He was looking at his shoes, probably wondering if he was next. "Elena, we're going to need your badge and your company laptop immediately," Sarah said. Her tone was clipped. She wanted me to be angry. She wanted a scene so she could justify the security guard standing awkwardly by the glass doors. I reached into my bag. I placed my badge on the table. It was the old design, the one from 10 years ago, slightly faded around the edges. It represented 3,650 days of being the first one in and the last one out. "The laptop is in my office," I said quietly. "It's encrypted, as per protocol. We'll need the master keys," Sarah added, leaning forward. I looked at her. She didn't realize that the master keys weren't a password written on a sticky note. They were a series of biometric handshakes and timed release tokens synced to a device she hadn't even asked for yet. "Everything I am legally required to provide is in the transition folder I created last month," I replied. I didn't tell her the transition folder was empty. I had created it, I just hadn't filled it. I was waiting for the performance review she had cancelled 3 times. "Good," she said, standing up. "We've already had the IT team revoke your remote access. We find it's better for everyone to have a clean break." She had no idea that my remote access wasn't the problem. The problem was that the entire system was built on a dead man's switch logic, not out of malice but out of necessity. If the system didn't see me check in every 72 hours to verify the integrity of the data shards, it would assume a breach had occurred, and lock the databases behind a 256-bit wall that even I would struggle to climb. I stood up, smoothed my skirt, and walked toward the door. The security guard followed me to my desk. My coworkers, people I'd mentored, people whose kids' names I knew, looked away. The silence was the loudest thing in the building. I packed my single box. A plant. A coffee mug. A framed photo of my father. As I walked out the front doors of the tech tower, I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I knew exactly what was going to happen next. I had built the machine. I knew how it breathed. And Sarah had just cut off its oxygen. They thought this was the end of me. They didn't realize it was the start of a countdown. To understand why Sarah's decision was so catastrophic, you have to understand what I did for 10 years. I started at the firm when we were 30 people in a rented warehouse. I was the lead engineer who designed the Vanguard protocol. It was the system that handled the logistics for the state's largest medical supply chain. I remember the 2018 blizzard. I stayed in the office for 3 days, sleeping on a couch, because the servers were overheating and the automated cooling had failed. I manually rerouted power to keep the shipments of insulin and heart medication moving. The CEO at the time, a man named Robert, gave me a handshake and a 5% stake in the company. But Robert retired. The company was bought out by a conglomerate, and then came Sarah. Sarah didn't care about the 2018 blizzard. She cared about optimizing overhead. In my 10 years, I had never missed a deadline. I had never had a system outage that lasted more than 4 minutes. I was the quiet one. The one who just made it work. The problem with being the person who just makes it work is that eventually, People think the work happens by itself. They stop seeing the effort and start seeing the salary as an unnecessary expense. My salary was high, earned through a decade of raises and bonuses. To Sarah, I wasn't the architect of the Vanguard protocol. I was just a line item on a spreadsheet that could be replaced by 3 junior devs from an offshore firm. I had spent my weekends documenting the code, but I kept the documentation on a local drive waiting for the company to provide the secure cloud storage I'd requested for 2 years. They never did. "We don't have the budget for extra storage," Sarah had told me. "Then the only copy of the manual is on my physical hardware," I warned. She had waved me off. "We'll cross that bridge when we come to it." Well, she was at the bridge now. And she'd burned it. I had built a fortress, and I was the only one with the map of the mines I'd laid to protect it. The erosion started 6 months ago. It began with the Monday morning strategy meetings. For 9 years, I sat to the right of the director. Then Sarah arrived. Suddenly, the meetings were moved to 8 a.m. knowing I had a standing commitment to drop my daughter at her specialized tutoring. I asked to join via Zoom. Sarah said, "We're really focusing on in-person synergy right now, Elena. If you can't make it, we'll just catch you up later." They never caught me up. I started seeing emails about the Project Phoenix initiative. I was the lead engineer, yet the emails were addressed to Sarah and 2 junior engineers who had been with us for 6 months. I walked into Sarah's office one afternoon. I noticed the architecture specs for Phoenix. There's a massive flaw in how the API handles the client's legacy data. If we push this live, it will corrupt the historical records. Sarah didn't even look up from her laptop. "The juniors say it's fine, Elena. Maybe you're just being too cautious. Technology has moved on from the way you built things 10 years ago." I stayed calm. "Logic doesn't move on, Sarah. Data integrity is a constant. We'll take it under advisement," she said. I knew then. I saw the way she looked at me like I was a piece of furniture that no longer matched the room's aesthetic. She didn't see the woman who saved the medical supply chain. She saw an obstacle to her agile rebranding. I went back to my desk. I didn't complain. I just started BCCing my personal email on every request I made for resources that were denied. Every warning I gave. Every under advisement she sent back. I watched as they hired a consultant to shadow me. They called it knowledge sharing. I knew it was replacement training. But there was one thing I didn't share. Not because I was being petty, but because they never asked the right question. They asked what the code did. They never asked why it did it that way. That's when I realized I was being erased. And I decided to let them do it. The atmosphere in the Level 4 briefing room was different that morning. Usually, these quarterly technical reviews were a place for rigorous data analysis and long-term planning. Today, the air felt rehearsed. Sarah sat at the head of the table, her laptop open, flanked by 2 new hires, Tyler and Julian. They were Agile Transformation Specialists, a title that, in my experience, usually meant they knew how to use Jira but couldn't explain how a load balancer actually functioned under stress. "Thank you all for coming," Sarah began. She didn't look at me. She looked at the Vice President of Operations who was patching in via video from the Chicago office. "As we look toward the Vanguard 2 rollout, it's become clear that our current infrastructure is stagnant. We're carrying too much legacy weight." She used the word legacy like it was a contagion. In my world, legacy meant the part of the system that actually generates revenue and hasn't crashed in 8 years. To her, it just meant old. "I've asked Tyler and Julian to present a streamlined roadmap," Sarah continued, "one that moves us away from Elena's more traditional architecture." I sat with my hands folded on the table. My notebook was open to a blank page. I didn't interrupt. I watched Tyler stand up and pull up a slide deck that was heavy on gradients and light on technical specifications. "We're proposing a full cloud-native migration by the end of the quarter," Tyler said, clicking through a series of before and after graphics. The before was a tangled gray mess labeled the current bottleneck. The after was a clean blue cloud. "By stripping away the manual verification layers and the redundant failsafes Elena built, we can increase data throughput by 40%. I noticed the VP in Chicago lean in. "And the security protocols?" "The Vanguard protocol was built specifically to handle state medical board compliance." Sarah jumped in before I could breathe. "We've analyzed the compliance requirements. Most of Elena's security is actually just unnecessary friction. It's slowing down the API, We can automate those handshakes and save 300 man-hours a month. I felt the eyes of the room shift to me. This was the moment where a younger, more insecure version of myself would have fought back. I would have explained that those redundant fail-safes were the only thing preventing a SQL injection from wiping the pharmacy database. I would have pointed out that automated handshakes without hardware-level tokens were a violation of our state contract. Instead, I stayed silent. I watched as they presented a plan that was essentially removing the brakes from a car because they were slowing it down. Elena, the VP finally spoke up. You've been very quiet. Do you have thoughts on this streamlining? I looked Sarah directly in the eyes. She was practically vibrating with the hope that I would get defensive. If I got angry, she could label me resistant to change. If I argued, I was not a team player. The math in Tyler's presentation is very optimistic, I said, my voice low and steady. If the goal is speed, this plan will certainly achieve it. Exactly, Sarah said, smiling. We need to move fast. Then I have nothing more to add, I replied. The meeting ended 20 minutes later. Sarah asked me to stay behind. Tyler and Julian lingered, whispering by the glass wall. Elena, we're making this official, Sarah said, her voice dropping the performative warmth it had during the meeting. We're transitioning you out of the lead architect role. As of this afternoon, Tyler is taking over the Vanguard migration. We'll need your credentials by 4 p.m. She expected a plea. She expected me to talk about my 10 years of service, the nights I spent in the server room, the relationships I'd built. I understand, I said. You'll be given a severance package consistent with your tenure, provided the handoff is seamless, she added. The handoff will be exactly as seamless as the systems you've just approved, I told her. I stood up. I didn't shake her hand. I walked out of the room, through the rows of cubicles where people I had trained were now staring at their monitors, afraid to catch the legacy sent on me. I went to my desk. I didn't delete anything that would be illegal. I didn't sabotage anything that would be unprofessional. I simply stopped the manual optimization scripts I ran every Tuesday. I logged out of the proprietary monitoring tool I'd written in Python, a tool they didn't even know existed because they never bothered to ask how I caught errors before the alarms went off. At 3:58 p.m., I sent a single email to Sarah, Tyler, and the HR director. Subject: Handover completion. Per your request, I have vacated the lead architect role. All company-issued credentials have been returned. The system is currently running on the streamlined parameters discussed this morning. Good luck with the migration. I picked up my box. The security guard, a man named Ray who I'd bought coffee for every morning for 5 years, looked heartbroken. You okay, Elena? He whispered. I'm fine, Ray, I said. I'm just going to go get some sleep. I think everyone else is going to be staying up late from now on. I thanked them, walked out the door, and felt the cool evening air on my face. Behind me, in that glass tower, they were celebrating their agility. They didn't realize that I was the only person who knew why the foundation wasn't cracking. And I had just taken the blueprints with me. The first 24 hours were the hardest, not because I was grieving, but because I had to fight the muscle memory of being a fixer. When you spend a decade as the load-bearing wall of a corporation, your brain becomes wired to listen for the frequency of a failing server or the subtle shift in a client's tone during a conference call. My phone was on my kitchen counter. It didn't vibrate. It didn't light up. Sarah had been thorough. My corporate accounts were wiped, my Slack access revoked, and my number likely scrubbed from the active emergency directory within minutes of my departure. I sat on my balcony with a cup of black coffee. For the first time in 3,650 days, I didn't have to check the latency reports for the 6 a.m. data sync. In the corporate world, people often confuse activity with value. Sarah, Tyler, and Julian were active. They were loud. They were currently in the office, likely high on the adrenaline of their new era, drinking expensive lattes and mapping out their Project Phoenix on glass whiteboards. They felt powerful because they had cleared the bottleneck, which was me. What they didn't realize is that some bottlenecks are actually filters. I spent Wednesday morning doing something I hadn't done in years. I went for a long walk in the park. I watched people who didn't know what a SQL database was, and I realized how small that glass tower really was. But even as I walked, my mind was running simulations. I knew the Vanguard protocol better than I knew my own heartbeat. I knew that at 10 p.m. on Wednesday nights, the system performed a pruning cycle. It was a piece of code I'd written 7 years ago to handle a very specific bug in the state's legacy hardware. The bug caused the system to double-count medication shipments unless a specific script intercepted the data packet and validated it against the physical inventory logs. In Tyler's streamlined presentation, he had labeled that script as redundant latency. He had marked it for deletion. If he had deleted it, the pruning cycle would run tonight. It wouldn't find the script. It wouldn't stop the double counting. By Thursday morning, the state medical board's dashboard would show that we had shipped twice as much insulin as we actually had in the warehouse. I would have sent a polite heads-up email to Marcus in HR or perhaps a former colleague. I would have saved them from themselves. But I remembered Sarah's face when she called me traditional. I remembered the VPs nodding along as they dismissed my decade of disaster prevention as unnecessary friction. To intervene now wouldn't just be helpful. It would be an insult to their agility. They wanted to own the system. Now, they owned the consequences. The silence of my phone wasn't just peace, it was a vacuum. And I knew that soon, the pressure differential between their incompetence and the reality of the system would become so great that the vacuum would start to scream. I went home, cooked a quiet dinner, and read a book. I didn't check the news. I didn't check LinkedIn. I didn't look at the company's stock price. I was an observer now. When I finally went to bed at 11 p.m., I felt a strange sense of clarity. Most people think revenge is a hot, active thing, slashed tires or leaked secrets, but real corporate justice is passive. It's simply stepping out of the way and letting a person who thinks they can fly jump off a roof. I closed my eyes. Somewhere across the city, in a cold server room, the 10 p.m. pruning cycle had already finished. The errors were already cascading through the database, silent and invisible, like a slow-acting poison in the bloodstream of the company. They mistook my silence for weakness. They didn't realize it was the sound of the clock ticking down. Thursday morning arrived with a stillness that was almost eerie. I woke up at 8 a.m., 2 hours later than my usual emergency response schedule. As I sipped my tea, I began to mentally inventory the architecture I had left behind. When people hear the word leverage, they think of stolen files or scandalous secrets. In high-level systems engineering, leverage is far more elegant. It's the difference between knowing how to drive a car and knowing why the engine makes that specific clicking sound when it's about to overheat. I didn't have a kill switch. I didn't need one. I simply had the only mental map of a fragile ecosystem. Over 10 years, the Vanguard protocol had grown into a sprawling web of dependencies. It wasn't just code. It was a living history of compromises. I had built it to be resilient, but that resilience was maintained through a series of manual handshakes and specific timing sequences that I had honed through trial and error. There were 3 specific points of leverage that Sarah, Tyler, and Julian didn't even know existed. The token rotator. To comply with state medical laws, our system had to renew its security tokens with the state pharmacy board every 72 hours. I had automated this, but the board's server was 40 years old. It required a slow drip data packet. If you sent the request too fast, which Tyler's streamlined API definitely would, the board's server would flag it as a DDoS attack and blacklist our IP address. The client trust factor. I wasn't just the engineer. I was the face of the company to the state medical board's technical director, a man named Dr. Eris Thorne. Eris was brilliant, prickly, and hated tech bros. He trusted me because I never lied to him about a system failure. He had my personal cell number, and he hadn't used it in 3 years because I never let a problem reach his desk. The metadata ghost. When Tyler deleted my redundant scripts, he wasn't just deleting code. He was deleting the translation layer. The Vanguard system talked in one language, and the state's reporting system talked in another. My scripts were the translator. Without them, the data would still flow, but it would be gibberish. I sat at my dining table and opened a notebook. I wrote down a timeline. Wednesday 10 p.m., the pruning cycle ran. The data corruption began. Thursday 9 a.m., the first batch of morning pharmacy reports would be generated. Thursday 11:30 a.m., the state pharmacy board would receive those reports. Friday 2 p.m., the 72-hour token rotation would trigger. Sarah and her team were currently sitting in the office, looking at their speed dashboards. They would see that the system was running 40% faster. They would see green lights everywhere because the monitoring tools I wrote, the ones that would have flagged the data corruption, had been replaced by Tyler's new, cleaner UI. His UI only checked if the server was on. It didn't check if the data was right. It's a common mistake in modern management. They value the appearance of health over the reality of function. Sarah wanted a dashboard that looked good in a PowerPoint presentation. I wanted a system that didn't kill people by miscounting their medication. I looked at my phone. It remained silent. Sarah didn't know that she was currently standing in the middle of a minefield, dancing because she thought she'd cleared the legacy clutter. She didn't realize that the clutter was the only thing marking the safe path. I didn't need to act. I didn't need to sabotage. I just had to let the clock run. The laws of logic and the rigidity of the state's legacy servers would do the work for me. In her arrogance, Sarah had assumed that my knowledge was a commodity she could buy elsewhere. She didn't realize that experience isn't just knowing what to do, it's knowing what not to do. And she was currently doing everything I had spent 10 years avoiding. I didn't need to act. Time would. Friday morning, the air in my apartment felt heavy, with the palpable sense of an approaching storm. I knew the corporate rhythm. By now, the new era coffee room chatter would be dying down. The initial high of firing the expensive legacy engineer was likely being replaced by the first cold drops of reality. At 9:15 a.m., I checked the public-facing portal for the State Pharmacy Board. This was a public site that displayed shipment statuses for every major provider in the region. It was the only window I had left into the house I'd built. The status icon for our company was still green. But I looked closer. I looked at the last updated timestamp. It was lagging. Usually, the Vanguard protocol pushed updates every 15 minutes. The timestamp was now 45 minutes old. This told me everything. Tyler's streamlined API wasn't just fast. It was overwhelming the receiver. The state's servers couldn't handle the unthrottled data dump. To compensate, their system was likely auto-dropping packets to prevent a crash. In the tech world, this is what we call silent failure. The dashboard looks fine, but underneath the surface, the data is bleeding out. I could almost see the scene in the office. Tyler would be staring at his speed dashboard, bragging about the 40% increase in throughput, while Julian probably noticed the slight delay but dismissed it as a local ISP issue. Sarah would be in her glass office, drafting a memo to the VP about how much friction they'd removed by getting rid of me. I spent the afternoon in my garden. The quiet was addictive, but my mind kept drifting back to the token rotator I mentioned earlier. It was due to trigger at 2 p.m. The token rotator was the heartbeat of our legal compliance. Every 72 hours, our system had to prove to the state that it was still authorized to handle medical data. It was a digital handshake. If that handshake failed 3 times, the state's firewall would automatically sever the connection. I checked my watch. 1:55 p.m. 2 p.m. 2:15 p.m. I refreshed the State Pharmacy Board portal. The green icon was gone. In its place was a gray connection lost symbol. Most people would assume this was a minor glitch, but in a medical supply chain, a gray icon means that pharmacies can't verify shipments. It means hospitals can't track incoming narcotics. It means the legal liability of the company just tripled in 15 minutes. I sat back in my chair. I didn't feel joy. I felt a grim sort of validation. I had told Sarah this would happen. I had put it in the Project Phoenix review notes that she'd ignored. I had even mentioned the hardware limitations of the state's servers in a meeting 6 months ago, to which she had replied, "We can't let their outdated tech dictate our innovation, Elena. Innovation is a wonderful word until you're the one who has to explain to the state attorney general why $4 million worth of heart medication is sitting in a warehouse because your agile system can't talk to the word government." The phone on my table didn't ring yet. They were still in the denial phase. They were probably rebooting the local routers, blaming the internet provider, or screaming at the junior devs to fix the connection. They hadn't realized yet that the lock didn't need fixing. The lock had been changed because they threw away the person who knew how to turn the key. They felt it before they understood it. The silence in their server room was the sound of my absence. You're probably thinking, "Elena, why didn't you just call them?" Because you don't learn how to handle a fire by having someone else put it out for you every time you play with matches. Sarah wanted the power. Now she has the responsibility. If you've ever watched a manager ignore a warning and walk straight into a wall, hit subscribe. If you think I'm being petty by letting them fail, go ahead and vent in the comments. Just remember, in the real world, I told you so doesn't pay the fines. Results do. Friday at 4:30 p.m. is usually when the corporate world starts to exhale, eyes drifting toward the weekend. But in a high-stakes logistics firm, 4:30 p.m. on a Friday is the most dangerous hour of the week. It's when the batch reports go out. I was sitting in my living room, the sun casting long shadows across the floor, when I saw the first sign of the structural collapse. I wasn't looking at the company's internal Slack, I was looking at a public Twitter feed for a regional pharmacy association. Vanguard portal down. Unable to verify Schedule 2 shipments. Emergency override not responding. Anyone else? Then another. System error code 503 on Vanguard. Same here, we have patients waiting. In the glass tower, this would be the moment the air conditioning felt like it had stopped working. Sarah and Tyler would be huddled around a monitor. They would see the 503 error. A 503 error is a service unavailable message, but in the context of the Vanguard protocol it was something much more specific. It meant the API gateway the speedy one Tyler had built had finally choked on its own data. Because it wasn't receiving the 72-hour token handshake from the state, it had defaulted into security lockdown mode. I had designed it that way. If the system couldn't verify it was talking to the government, it would stop talking entirely to prevent a HIPAA violation. I imagined Tyler trying to bypass the lockdown. He would be typing frantically, trying to find the override command. But I hadn't put the override command in the main code. I'd buried it in a subdirectory labeled environment, constants. To a junior dev, it looked like a folder of boring configuration files. To me, it was the emergency brake. Then, the second crack appeared. A colleague I actually respected, a senior database admin named David, sent me a text. It was the first communication I'd had from the inside since I walked out. Elena. Everything is gray. Tyler tried to force a reboot and now the primary database is stuck in read-only mode. Sarah is losing her mind. Did you leave a manual for the token rotator anywhere? I didn't reply immediately. I waited 10 minutes. Then I typed. The documentation is in the transition folder I created for Sarah. Hope you guys have a good weekend, David. I knew, and David knew, that the folder was empty. I hadn't hidden the files. I simply hadn't uploaded them because Sarah had revoked my server access before I could finish the transfer. She had prioritized my immediate removal over a safe transition. At 5:15 p.m., the first crack became a cavernous split. The vice president of operations, the man from the Chicago office, was no longer on a video call. He was likely on a private jet or at least on a very angry phone call with the CEO. The state contract was worth $40 million a year. Every hour the system was down, the liquidated damages clause in the contract kicked in. The company was currently losing $15,000 every 60 minutes. My phone finally did what I knew it would do. It buzzed on the table. It was the main office line. I let it ring. I watched it vibrate until it went to voicemail. 10 seconds later, it rang again, and again. On the fourth attempt, I picked it up. I didn't say, hello. I just waited. Elena? It was Sarah. Her voice was 2 octaves higher than it had been on Tuesday. The agile confidence was gone. It had been replaced by the raw, jagged edge of panic. Elena, we have a minor synchronization issue with the state portal. Tyler is working on it, but we need to know where you stored the handshake logs. I took a slow sip of my tea. Sarah? It's Friday evening. I'm currently on personal time, I said, my voice as flat as a desert floor. I know, and I'm sorry to bother you, she stammered, but the system is locked. We can't verify shipments. We have pharmacies reporting shortages. That sounds like a serious architecture failure, I said. Luckily, you have Tyler and Julian. They mentioned they could handle the legacy weight quite easily. There was a long silence on the other end. I could hear Tyler shouting in the background about reindexing the tables. He was about to make a mistake that would wipe the last 4 hours of transaction data. Elena, please, Sarah whispered. I'll have to check my consulting availability and get back to you, Sarah. Enjoy your evening. I hung up. That's when my phone rang. And for the first time in 10 years, I was the one holding the silence. The weekend was a masterclass in corporate desperation. By Saturday morning, the minor synchronization issue had evolved into a full-scale logistical blackout. My phone was no longer just buzzing. It was a rhythmic pulse of texts, voicemails, and LinkedIn messages. I spent the morning at a local library, reading a book on architectural history. There is something grounding about structures that have stood for 500 years when you are watching a digital empire crumble in 5 days. At 11:45 a.m., a text came through from the VP of Operations, Marcus. It wasn't a demand, it was a plea.
Elena, I'm in the city. Can we meet for coffee? My treat. Name the place. We need your eyes on something just for 10 minutes.
I didn't respond for 3 hours. When I did, I kept it professional. I'm unavailable for meetings today, Marcus. If there is a technical emergency, I suggest reaching out to the lead architect, Tyler. He was very confident in the new roadmap. The response was instant.
Tyler is the reason the database is in read-only mode. We're losing the state contract, Elena. Eris Thorne from the medical board refuses to speak to anyone but you. He told Sarah to get the adult back in the room and hung up.
I smiled at that. Dr. Thorne was many things: abrupt, demanding, and impatient, but he valued competence above all else. He didn't care about agile sprints or synergy. He cared that the heart medication reached the clinics. By Sunday evening, the tone of the messages changed from "where are the files" to "what will it take?" Sarah called again at 7 p.m. This time, I answered on the first ring. I wanted to hear the sound of a person who had realized they were replaceable, while the person they fired was not. "Elena, thank God," she said. She sounded like she hadn't slept since Tuesday. "Look, we're prepared to offer you a one-time consulting fee to come in tonight and reset the token rotator. Just 2 hours of work. We'll pay you double your previous hourly rate." "Sarah, I'm a private citizen now," I said calmly. "I don't have an hourly rate anymore. I have a project fee, and I don't work on Sundays. We don't have time for this," she snapped, the old Sarah bubbling to the surface for a second before she caught herself. "The state audit begins tomorrow at 8 a.m. If the portal isn't live, they'll trigger the failure to perform clause. That's a 7-figure penalty." "It sounds like a very stressful situation for you," I replied. "But I've already made plans for the evening. I'm sure Tyler and Julian can find the override folder. It's right where I left it. They can't find it. They said you must have deleted it." "I didn't delete it. I just didn't label it emergency button for incompetent managers. That would have been unprofessional." There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end. Sarah wasn't used to people speaking to her without the filter of corporate hierarchy. She had forgotten that once she took away my job, she took away her power over me. "What do you want, Elena?" "I don't want anything, Sarah. I'm quite enjoying my retirement. But if the company wishes to engage my consulting firm, which I registered on Wednesday, I will send over a statement of work on Monday morning, after I've had my coffee." "Monday morning is too late." "Then I suppose the audit will go exactly how your new architecture deserves," I said. "Good night, Sarah." I hung up and turned my phone to Do Not Disturb. I sat in the silence of my living room, watching the lights of the city. I wasn't being cruel. I was being precise. In the corporate world, if you fix a disaster too quickly, they never learn the cost of the mistake. They think it was just a glitch. For Sarah to never do this to anyone else, she had to feel the full weight of the silence. She had to sit in the dark and realize that the legacy weight she had cut away was actually the only thing keeping the roof over her head. I told them I'd think about it. But I already knew the answer. The clock wasn't my enemy anymore, it was my most effective negotiator. Monday morning arrived with the kind of clarity that only comes when you are no longer a participant in someone else's chaos. I woke up at 7:30 a.m., made a slow breakfast, and watched the birds in the park across from my window. At 8:01 a.m., my inbox pinged. It wasn't a statement of work request. It was an automated system alert, one I had set up years ago as a backup to my backup. It was a critical system failure notification from the State Medical Board's public transparency site. The audit had begun. And the Vanguard protocol was still dark. I sat at my laptop, looking at the command line interface of my private server. I still had a lingering backdoor read-only view of the company's data traffic. I hadn't used it to interfere, but I used it now to see the damage. It was a massacre. Tyler had tried to run a force sync script at 3 a.m. In his haste, he hadn't cleared the cache. The system was now stuck in an infinite loop, trying to upload the same 40,000 pharmacy records over and over again. I could fix this. I really could. I could send a single line of code to David, the senior admin, and the loop would break. The read-only lock would lift. The token rotator would sync, and by 9 a.m., the company would be back in compliance. Sarah would keep her job. The VP would stop sweating. The pharmacies would get their data. This was my moral crossroad. On one side was professional altruism. The idea that because I could help, I should help. That the higher ground was protecting the clients and the patients, regardless of how I had been treated. On the other side was natural consequences. If I intervened now, I would be validating Sarah's entire philosophy. I would be proving that you can fire a veteran, replace them with cheaper, less competent labor, and then count on the veteran's good heart to bail you out for free when the ship starts to sink. If I fixed it now, I wasn't being a hero, I was being an enabler. I thought about the pharmacies. I thought about the patients. But then I remembered the architecture. I had built the system with 3 layers of emergency backups. Sarah had ordered Tyler to disable 2 of them because they were too expensive to maintain. The patients weren't being put at risk by my silence. They had been put at risk by Sarah's budget cuts 6 months ago. I decided to do something more difficult than acting. I decided to wait. I closed the laptop. I put on my coat and went to a museum. I spent the afternoon looking at Renaissance artworks created by masters who understood that a foundation takes time and that you cannot streamline a masterpiece. While I was looking at a painting of a crumbling Roman pillar, my phone buzzed. It was a voicemail from Marcus, the VP. He sounded broken. "Elena, we're at the board office. Dr. Thorne has called for a show cause hearing. They're talking about revoking the license. Sarah is. Well, she's not here. She's been asked to take a leave of absence. Please. Call me." Sarah was gone. I felt a slight pang of sympathy for the junior devs, Tyler and Julian. They were out of their depth, following the orders of a woman who prioritized her own career over the health of the system. But they had also sat in that meeting and mocked legacy weight. They had to learn what weight actually felt like when you were the one carrying it. I didn't cause the damage. I didn't write the bad code. I didn't ignore the warnings. I simply stopped being the shield that protected them from their own decisions. I didn't cause the damage. I just stopped preventing it. Monday afternoon felt like the climax of a disaster movie where the protagonists realize the backup generator is also out of fuel. I didn't need to be in the office to feel the heat. The digital trail told the story for me. By 2 p.m., the show cause hearing at the State Medical Board had turned into an interrogation. Because I still had my industry contacts, I knew that the board wasn't just asking about the current outage. They were asking about the integrity of the data. When Tyler ran that force sync script at 3 a.m., he didn't just create an infinite loop. He created data collisions. Because the token rotator hadn't verified the connection, the system started assigning the same shipment ID to multiple different pharmacies. I saw it on the public-facing error logs. The system was spitting out duplicate key errors by the thousands. This wasn't just a down system anymore. It was a corrupt system. In the world of medical logistics, down is a fine, corrupt is a prison sentence. I was sitting in a quiet cafe when my LinkedIn notifications began to explode. Not from recruiters, but from the board of directors of my former company. These were the people who sat in high-rise offices and only cared about the stock price. The stock price had dropped 14% since the market opened. A man named Arthur, the chairman of the board, sent me a direct message. "Elena, I understand there has been a significant misunderstanding regarding your role. I would like to speak with you privately. We are looking for an external auditor to assess the current crisis." I stirred my coffee. External auditor. It was a clever way of asking me to come back without admitting they had been wrong to fire me. They wanted my expertise, but they wanted to label it as a consultancy to save face. Meanwhile, back at the office, the fracture was widening. I received a frantic call from David. He was hiding in the break room. "Elena, it's a war zone," he whispered. "The VP is screaming at Tyler. Tyler is blaming the legacy framework you left behind, saying it was pre-sabotaged. They're actually looking through your old commits to see if you planted a virus." I laughed. It was a dry, hollow sound. "David, they can look all they want. Every line of code I wrote was peer-reviewed and signed off by the previous director. If Tyler can't read a Python script without calling it a virus, that's his problem. The board is here, Elena. They've locked Tyler out of the server room. They realized he was making it worse. But they don't know how to unlock the read-only state. Even the offshore team is stumped. This was the escalation. It was no longer about a manager's ego or a junior's ambition. It was about the survival of the firm. The state was preparing a cease and desist order. If that happened, the company would be barred from bidding on government contracts for 5 years. It would be the end of the business. I checked my watch. 3:30 p.m. David, I said. Tell Marcus that I am available for a meeting at 9 a.m. tomorrow. But I won't be meeting at the office. I'll be at my lawyer's office. Your lawyer? David sounded shocked. If they're accusing me of sabotage, I think it's best we have the conversation in a controlled environment, don't you? The silence on the other end was heavy. They needed someone to blame. Sarah had already been sacrificed, but that wasn't enough to satisfy the board of directors or the state. They wanted a villain, but they forgot that a villain is only dangerous when they're in the building. Once you throw them out, they're just a witness. They needed someone to blame. They just didn't realize I had the receipts to show exactly where the fire started. The tech tower didn't feel like a temple of innovation anymore. It felt like a crime scene. When I walked back through those revolving doors at 1 p.m. on Tuesday, the atmosphere was thick with the scent of stale coffee and genuine fear. The agile transformation posters Sarah had hung in the lobby were peeling at the corners. The junior devs were gone. Tyler's desk had been cleared so fast there was still a half-eaten bagel in his trash can. I was escorted directly to the server room, the hot zone. Waiting there was the board's legal counsel and a representative from the state medical board. The corruption has spread to the billing layer, the state rep said, his voice cold. If you can't isolate the duplicate records in the next 6 hours, we're pulling the plug on the entire Vanguard contract. We'll be migrating the data to your largest competitor, Omni Logistics, by dawn. Omni Logistics, the company that had tried to headhunt me 3 years ago. If the contract moved to them, my former company wouldn't just lose revenue. They would lose their reason for existing. They would be forced to liquidate within months. I sat down at the terminal. I didn't panic. Panic is what Tyler had done when he saw the first error code. I simply pulled up the root directory. What are you doing? Marcus asked, hovering behind me. I'm looking for the heartbeat, I said. I navigated to the folder Tyler had ignored, the one labeled environment, constants. I opened the file he thought was useless metadata. Inside was the original logic for the 2018 Blizzard, the manual override I'd written to handle hardware desynchronization. I executed a rollback to known good state command. I didn't wipe the last week of data, that would be a disaster. Instead, I triggered a script that compared the transaction IDs against the physical warehouse logs I knew were stored on an offline backup I'd secretly maintained on the internal intranet. As the script began to run, the screens in the room turned from red to amber. The infinite loops began to break. The duplicate key errors slowed from a flood to a trickle. But while I was saving the system, the company was still collapsing. Upstairs, in the executive wing, the reckoning was final. Because the board had discovered Sarah's suppressed emails, they weren't just firing her. They were suing her for breach of fiduciary duty. They needed a scalp to hand to the state medical board to prove they were taking the failure seriously. I watched through the glass wall of the server room as security escorted the remaining members of Sarah's steering committee out of the building. These were the people who had laughed at her jokes while she mocked my traditional methods. Now, they were being treated like intruders. It's working, David whispered, looking at the latency graph. The blue line, the one representing healthy data flow, was finally climbing. By 5:30 p.m., the state portal turned green. The connection lost icon vanished. You did it, Marcus said, letting out a breath he seemed to have been holding for days. Elena, you saved us. I stood up and grabbed my coat. I didn't smile. I didn't offer a celebratory handshake. I didn't save the company, Marcus, I said. I saved the data. There's a difference. What do you mean? The system is stable, but the trust is gone. You lost your lead architect, your management team, and your reputation with the medical board in the span of a week. The code is fixed, but the culture that allowed Sarah to happen is still in the walls. I walked out of the server room. Behind me, the machines were humming perfectly, finally back in the hands of someone who understood them. But the office was empty. The agile dream had ended in a silent, professional slaughter. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. The silence of the empty desk spoke louder than I ever could. The aftermath of a corporate collapse is surprisingly quiet. There are no sirens, no shouting, just the sound of lawyers zipping up briefcases and the low hum of servers that finally have nothing left to prove. On Wednesday morning, I didn't go to the tech tower. I went to a small, sun-drenched office in the historic district. I had signed the lease for this space the day after I was fired. It was small, but it had high ceilings and a view of the river. The brass plaque on the door simply read, Evance Systems Architecture and Integrity. At 10 a.m., my first visitor arrived. It was Dr. Eris Thorne from the State Medical Board. You look remarkably relaxed for a woman who just performed open-heart surgery on a dying corporation, he said, taking a seat across from my desk. He didn't offer a handshake, he offered a folder. I'm an engineer, Eris, I replied. We're trained to handle pressure. It's the arrogance we have trouble with. He nodded, tapping the folder. The board has officially terminated the Vanguard contract with your former employer. They cited unrecoverable leadership failure. They've triggered the emergency transition clause. This was the final blow. Without the Vanguard contract, the company I'd spent 10 years building would be a shell. They would have to pivot to small-scale logistics, likely laying off another 40% of the staff by the end of the quarter. The board wants to know if your new firm is prepared to handle the transition to Omni Logistics, Eris continued. They don't trust Omni's internal team to migrate the data without your oversight. They want you as the independent state-appointed gatekeeper. You'll have full authority to audit their systems before a single byte of patient data is moved. This was the resolution I had envisioned, but hadn't dared to hope for. I wasn't just getting my old job back, I was being elevated above the entire industry. I would be the one telling the giants of the field whether their agile systems were actually safe. Later that afternoon, Marcus called. He sounded like a man who was speaking from the bottom of a very deep well. Elena, I heard about the board's decision. I suppose I should congratulate you. There's nothing to congratulate, Marcus, I said. This was the inevitable result of the decisions made 6 months ago. You chose to value Sarah's synergy over technical reality. This is just the bill coming due. We're offering a buyout, he said, his voice cracking. The board of directors is liquidating. They want to know if your new firm is interested in purchasing the IP for the original Vanguard protocol. Since you're the only one who can run it anyway. They were offering to sell me my own life's work for pennies on the dollar just to clear their debts and avoid further litigation. I looked at the river outside my window. I had spent 10 years being the quiet competence in the corner. I had been the legacy weight they wanted to shed. Now, I owned the scale. Send the paperwork to my lawyer, Marcus, I said. And tell whoever is left in that building to make sure the servers stay cool until Friday. I'll be coming by to pick up my hardware. I hung up. I didn't feel a rush of adrenaline. I didn't feel like a victor. I felt the deep, steady satisfaction of a machine that had been calibrated correctly. The arrogance had been removed. The incompetence had been purged. I didn't need vengeance. I just needed the truth to be the last thing standing. I sat in my new office for a long time that evening, the blue light of my monitor reflecting off the glass. On the screen was the final confirmation of the IP transfer. The Vanguard protocol, the millions of lines of code I had nurtured like a living thing, was officially mine. Looking back, the collapse of the tower wasn't caused by a single person. Sarah was just the catalyst. The real rot was the collective delusion that you can replace deep, localized knowledge with process. In the corporate world, they love to talk about loyalty. But they usually mean the loyalty of the employee to the firm. They rarely talk about the loyalty of the firm to the expertise that sustains it. For 10 years, I was loyal to the system. I was loyal to the logic. I was loyal to the patients who needed their medicine. The company, however, was only loyal to the current quarter's metrics. I've learned that silence is the most underrated tool in a professional's kit. When I was being pushed out, I didn't argue. I didn't beg. I didn't give them a reason to fire me. I simply stepped back and allowed the vacuum of my absence to do the work. People think of power as a loud thing, a CEO giving a speech, a manager firing a subordinate. But true power is the ability to walk away and watch the world you built stop turning because you aren't there to push the button. I thought about Tyler and Julian. They weren't villains. They were just arrogant. They were products of a culture that tells young people that disruption is a virtue in itself. They didn't understand that before you disrupt a system, you have to understand why it was built that way in the first place. You don't remove a load-bearing wall because you think the room would look airier without it. And I thought about Sarah. She was a professional climber who forgot that the ladder has to be leaning against a solid building. She spent all her energy climbing and none of it checking the foundations. If there is a lesson in all of this, it's that competence is a quiet authority. It doesn't need to shout. It doesn't need a Project Phoenix slide deck to justify its existence. It just needs to be right. I'm no longer an employee. I'm an architect of my own destiny now. The phone still rings, Marcus, former colleagues, even competitors, but the tone has changed. They no longer ask me to hop on a call or join a sync. They ask for my time, and they pay for my perspective. Loyalty ignored is a debt that eventually comes due. And I was the only one left to collect. Friday morning, I walked into the tech tower one last time. The air was different, it smelled like ozone and transition. The lobby was quiet, the frantic energy of the show cause hearing replaced by the somber reality of a liquidation. I didn't head to the executive suites. I went straight to the server room. David was there, waiting with 2 hard drives. The transition to Omni Logistics starts at noon, he said, handing me the drives. But I made sure the local backups were encrypted with your personal key. Just like you asked. Thanks, David, I said. I looked at the flickering lights of the server racks. What are you going to do? I've got an interview with a startup on Monday, he smiled. They're looking for someone who values legacy stability. I think I'll fit right in. I left the building with my equipment. As the revolving doors clicked behind me, I felt a weight lift that I hadn't even realized I was carrying. For 10 years, I had been the guardian of a system that didn't know it needed one. Now I was just a woman with 2 hard drives and a reputation that preceded me. In this industry, we are often told that we are family. But families don't replace you with a cheaper model the moment a new manager wants to hit a bonus target. Companies are not families, they are ecosystems. And in any ecosystem, the organisms that ignore the laws of their environment, laws like data integrity, respect for experience, and the physics of logic, eventually go extinct. Sarah thought she was the predator. She thought I was the prey because I was quiet. She didn't realize that in a world built on code, the person who understands the code is the environment. You cannot fight the air you breathe. I got into my car and drove toward the river. My phone buzzed. It was a notification from my new firm's bank account. The initial deposit for the state audit had cleared. It was more than my entire annual salary at the tower. But it wasn't about the money. It was about the fact that when the world broke, they had to come to me to fix it. Not because I was the loudest, but because I was the one who stayed when things got cold. The tower is still there, but the name on the top is going to change soon. The agile posters will be replaced by another set of buzzwords. People will come and go, trying to disrupt and pivot their way to the top. But somewhere, in the foundation of every system that actually works, there is someone like me. Someone who knows where the mines are. Someone who knows why the engine clicks. And if you're that person, remember this, your silence isn't a lack of power. It's the fuse. The truth doesn't need to scream. It just needs to be the last thing standing. You've reached the end of corporate justice. If you're still here, you're the kind of person who knows that competence is the only true currency. If you haven't subscribed by now, you're essentially siding with the people who think they can replace you with an AI or a spreadsheet. Don't be the person who laments in the comments about why they didn't act. Hit subscribe and take your power back.